Good evening. Welcome to our Old Testament Bible study. We're in Zechariah chapter 11 tonight. And here we are after the 4th of July, and this COVID pandemic still got us. When we shut down in the middle of March, we never dreamed that it'd be going on like it is still, did we? We kept thinking that we'll shut down 2 or 3 weeks and flatten the curve and life would go back to normal. Now we're wondering when and if it ever will go back to normal. But we're doing the best we can to keep fighting, not give in, live wisely, carry on, and learn how to live life safely. Zechariah 11. Zechariah, the prophet to the returned exiles. They've been away, shut down into Babylon for 70 years. They've come back and they've started to rebuild, trying to figure out how to do it. I confess to you before we get started with these 17 verses in chapter 11 that these are really difficult for me. You might have a better handle on it than me, but we'll deal with it here. It looks like it's about 3 sections of these 17 verses. There's a judgment across the land, and then there's a glimpse prophetically to the Good Shepherd, the Lord Jesus. And then at the end is a foolish shepherd that's raised up. I believe that's looking all the way to the last days, and we're a lot closer to him than Zechariah was, and he's a warning about the Antichrist that would be raised up. Let's start with verse 1 here. Zechariah 11. Open thy doors, O Lebanon, that thy fire may devour thy cedars. Remember the cedars of Lebanon, where they got the cedars at that they built the temple out of when Solomon was building it to begin with. But now it's talking about, watch out Lebanon, there's a fire going to come and burn your cedars up. So we get an introduction here. It looks like, hey, there's judgment coming. It's coming not just to Israel, but across the land here. Howl, fir tree, for the cedar's fallen, because the mighty are spoiled. Howl, O you oaks of Bashan, I think that's in northern Israel, for the forest of the vintage is come down. Judgments across the world here. There's a voice of the howling of the shepherds, and usually you think of the shepherds as the leaders of God's people, but these shepherds, I believe, are the false shepherds. That when you read the minor prophets and the major prophets of the Old Testament, there was always a remnant of faithful shepherds that were leading God's people. They had the truth. Zechariah was one of them. But then it's like on every street corner there were other people, especially when you read about when the enemy Babylon was at the door getting ready to carry God's people off, and you had faithful shepherds saying, hey, God's going to judge us. He's going to allow us to be carried down in, like Daniel or Jeremiah said, for 70 years we'll be carried off into a foreign country. But for everyone that was the truth, seems like there was about 10 of them that was on the corners telling the people, says, don't you worry about nothing. We're God's people. God ain't going to let nothing happen to us. Why, he'll get us out of here before anything ever happens like that. But we find out that now we can look back and see who had the truth. And it's these that we have recorded in the Bible. So there were a lot of false shepherds then, in Jesus' day, and in our day. Jesus, the New Testament warns us, watch out for them wolves in sheep's clothing. They pretend to be something else, but they're really wolves, and they're not sheep, and they're certainly not shepherds. There's a voice of the howling of the shepherds, for their glory is spoiled. A voice of the roaring of young lions, for the pride of Jordan is spoiled. For thus saith the Lord my God, feed the flock of the slaughter, whose possessors slay them, and hold themselves not guilty. And they that sell them say, blessed be the Lord, for I'm rich. And their own shepherds pity them not. Well, these false shepherds in that day and this day, you can tell one thing about them that makes them false. They don't care about their people at all. They're false shepherds. And it's like they're selling the flocks. As long as they're getting something out, they're fine. They're in it. They're hirelings, as the New Testament says. They're in it for the money, not because they care about the people. And they say, I'm rich. And that may be a prophetic inkling glimpse into the last days church too, when you flip over to Revelation chapter 3 and read about the 7 churches of of the last days there. And if they're in order, the seventh one is the church of Laodicea. And they're the ones that said, Jesus condemned them, said, you say that you're rich and in need of nothing, because they were materially rich and doing well. But then Jesus said, you need to buy of me gold. What they had was just world's gold. They didn't have what the Lord was offering them, the stuff that really counts and lasts forever, the spiritual gold. For you say that I'm rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. For I will no more pity the inhabitants of the land, saith the Lord, but lo, I will deliver the men, every one into his neighbor's hand. There's going to be violence filling the world. And into the hand of his king. Now, back in that day, the king was pretty much the government. Man, there's been lots of people died at the hands of their governments in these communist nations, haven't they? And they shall smite the land, and out of their hand I'll not deliver them. And I will feed the flock of slaughter, even you, O poor of the flock. And Zechariah, I think he's going to do one of those dramatic action things that the Old Testament prophets often did. They would do something that would get, if there's newspapers in that day, it would have made the front page. Like Ezekiel, remember one time he acted out something. He went into his house, he locked himself in, he wouldn't come out, and he dug a hole, and he come up out in the streets. And then he used that for a message. He got a crowd that way. Or one of the other prophets, I think, laid on his side, or no, he walked around naked in the streets. That got to everybody's attention, wouldn't it? And then when he got everybody's attention, he said, this is what God's going to do to you. So, I will feed the flock of slaughter. Zechariah says, verse 7, O poor of the flock, and I took unto me 2 staves, 2 sticks, 2 shepherd sticks, if you would. He said, I called one of them beauty, which literally translate grace. And the other one I called bands, which literally translate unity, grace and unity. Now Zechariah says he's going to act something out here. I took 2 shepherds' flocks, grace and unity, and that's what I fed the flock with. Now, I don't know, I'm assuming verse 8 is the Lord speaking through Zechariah, and that Zechariah didn't literally cut these people off, but if it is, I don't know how he did it. I hope he didn't kill them, but he said there was 3 shepherds also I cut off in 1 month. Somehow he stopped them. And I think it's more likely the Lord's voice speaking through Zechariah, because he said, my soul loathed them, and their soul abhorred me. Now that's one reason you always know a false shepherd if it's God, and they really hate God. They're just in it for some other reasons. Then said, I will not feed you. That dieth, let it die. That's cut off, let it be cut off. And let the rest eat every one another, one the flesh of another. The violence is going to devour the land. He said, I'm not going to stop it. Now Zechariah, I think, speaking again in verse 10, says, I took my staff. Remember, he's got the beauty and the bands, 2 sticks. Even beauty. You want to talk about that one first. Grace. And I cut it asunder. Now that's dramatic action. The prophet goes out there and he thinks, this one's beauty. This one's beauty. It's grace. And he took it in front of it and he sawed it in half. Why did he do that? That was his object lesson that he's going to make his point with. That I might break my covenant which I made with all the people. And he said, well, now God never breaks his covenant. God's covenant is eternal, isn't it? Yes, in the New Testament it is, because let me show you the difference. In the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the same word, testament and covenant, under the Old Covenant, which wasn't like it failed and God said, let's try something else. It was took to the fullness of times to get to the New Covenant. But under the Old Covenant, God made a deal with human beings. And God did his part, but it was upon the human beings to do their part too. And the human beings were sinful. We couldn't keep up our end of the bargain. So we broke the covenant with God. Now the difference is in the New Testament or the New Covenant, God did it all. It's not dependent upon us at all for our salvation. It's like God became a man in Jesus. He lived the life without sin from the cradle to the grave that would be demanded of us if we was going to get to heaven. See, there may be some of you thinking when you get to the grave that God's going to look and say, well, I believe his good outweighs his bad. I'm going to have to let him in. But the Bible teaches that God can't let one sin in without being dealt with. You've got to be absolutely perfect. Jesus said, be ye therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's your end of the covenant if you want to keep up a bargain like that. But you've already failed. We all have. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But yet, God needed that perfect human being to keep up that end of it. And there wasn't one. So God became one in the person of Jesus Christ. And he lived from the cradle to the grave without ever sinning, without ever breaking any of God's laws, without even having a sinful thought. He was absolute perfection from the cradle to the grave. Therefore, that sinless human being could take God's punishment upon him that you deserved and I deserved. He could pay our sin debt. If he'd ever sinned, he'd only had to be paying his own sin debt. He didn't have one, but he was able to pay off yours. Therefore, the covenant under the New Testament is eternal and it's all on grace. It's already been kept up by Jesus. You don't have to do it. You just have to accept it. It's not by works, but by grace have you been saved. But under this Old Testament, human beings couldn't keep it. The covenant was broken. Here it says, Zechariah says, I sawed that grace thing in half in the Old Covenant. Well, it was because the humans had done that. They had broke the grace covenant, which I'd made with all the people. And it was broken in that day. And so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. And I said unto them, if you think good, give me my price. And if not, forbear, okay. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Now you may recognize that verse from the New Testament. Here is where all the New Testament writers tell us that Judas Iscariot, when he went and betrayed Jesus into the hands of the enemy, he was paid 30 pieces of silver, which I've been told was literally the price of a slave. So Zechariah is prophesying something that he may not have been aware of what he was doing, but in his dramatic action, that prophecy by the Holy Spirit's been carried into the New Testament age, and when Jesus was being betrayed by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. And it gets better. And the Lord said to me, cast it to the potter. And you'd say, if we didn't have any more information from the New Testament, what in the world does that mean? Why would you give the potter 30 pieces of silver? And from the New Testament, we learned that there was a field outside of Jerusalem. It must have been a place that had some good clay in it, because they called it the potter's field. That's where they would go out and get their clay. But it was later. Well, I'm going to get ahead. The Lord said to me, cast it to the potter, a goodly price that I was priced at them, and I took the 30 pieces of silver. I mean, boy, the literal number was fulfilled, wasn't it? And cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Now, none of that would have made sense if we didn't have the rest of the information of the New Testament. You threw it to the potter in the house of the Lord. Well, we read the Easter story, the resurrection story, the Good Friday, the betrayal story, all that in the Gospels. We find out Judas made that deal to betray Christ for 30 pieces of silver. And then later he felt guilty and he said, I can't take this money. And he tried to give it back to him. And the hypocritical priest in that day, the Pharisees, they said, oh, no, we're holy men. We can't take that money. It's blood money. Well, they're the ones that paid it to him to have him betrayed. And they wouldn't take it back because they were acting all high and mighty, and Judas just threw it down in the temple. And the enemy, the Pharisees, they said, well, what are we going to do with this money? And they said, well, we can't take it. We can't put it in the treasury. It's blood money. Says it's sinful. Says we'll take it out and we'll purchase a field in the name of Judas. And they bought that old potter's field, and it became where Judas went out and killed himself there in his field. Later it became a burying ground for the poor, I'm told. But the Lord said unto me, well, I skipped one, I think, 14. Then I cut asunder my other staff, bands. The unity is going to be broken now. Well, we're seeing that in America today, ain't we? We're at odds about everything we can think of. That I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Them was all supposed to be God's people. And their brotherhood was even going to be broken. And the Lord said unto me, take unto thee yet the instruments of a foolish shepherd. Now I think we're looking all the way ahead to the ultimate foolish shepherd, the Antichrist that'll be raised up. For lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land which shall not visit those that be cut off, neither shall he seek the young one. Well, he won't heal that which is broken. He won't feed that stands still, but he'll eat the flesh of the fat and tear their claws in pieces. He'll be destructive. And the last verse is, woe, W-O-E. When you run across that in the Old Testament, it means judgment's about to come. In this case, judgment will come to him. Woe to the idle shepherd. That don't mean a lazy one. It's I-D-O-L. It's woe to that shepherd or any shepherd that's leading God's people to somewhere that's not God, because then he's leading them to an idol. Woe to the idle shepherd that leaves the flock. The sword will be upon his arm. He didn't take care of his sheep. God says, well, I'll cut his arm off. Metaphorically, I think. And upon his right eye, he didn't keep an eye on the sheep like a good shepherd. And his arm will be clean dried up, and his right eye will be utterly darkened. Now, let me close with this right here. How do you know if you got a good shepherd or an idle shepherd? Well, a good shepherd will lead you to the good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. If you've got a shepherd that's leading you anywhere else besides Jesus, then get away from him. John tells us over in the New Testament, says, believe not every spirit. Test the spirits to see if they be of God. If somebody's uplifting Jesus Christ and trying to get you to live a good and holy, a biblical life, then there's a pretty good seal that is a good shepherd who's an under shepherd to the chief shepherd. See you next time. God bless you.